Alarming reports from the National Report Card regarding a learning loss resulting from the canceling of in-person instruction that has resulted in Virginia, the seventh most educated state in the nation, ranking sixth for declines in reading and mathematics aptitude. Some have sharply criticized public school administrators for closing public schools, while others have defended their actions in the face of an unprecedented pandemic, times historically associated with fear, confusion, and despair. Yet, as reiterated in the landmark regulatory deference doctrine case Chevron USA v. NRDC, the courts have long recognized that considerable weight should be accorded to those entrusted to those matters. And if their choice represents a reasonable accommodation of conflicting policies that were committed to the agency's care by statute, we should not disturb it unless it appears from the statute or its legislative history that accommodation is not one that Congress would have sanctioned. And it is a foundational principle of administrative law that judicial review of agency action is limited to the grounds the agency invoked when it took the action, what was known at the time. On March 13, 2020, when Interim Superintendent Cynthia Johnson and Arlington Public School Board Chairperson Monique O'Grady made the abrupt decision to halt in-person instruction, certainly it should have been known that viral particles are by far the most abundant biological entities on our planet, and that before what would be only the seventh human coronavirus, there were only a total of 219 viruses harmful to mankind, making the emergence of what was only the seventh human coronavirus an occurrence that should have appeared to a reasonable person to have defied the odds under the law of large numbers, a concept that students should have mastered by at least completion of high school. And yet educators in the community, with most government scientists, had decided for unknown and as of yet unarticulated reasons to reject that rather simple and rudimentary mathematical and scientific proposition, making the decision even before the nation's only physician serving as a state governor to close the doors to in-person instruction beginning on March 14, 2020, and not beginning to reopen the doors to in-person instruction until a year later on March 15, 2021. And those are simply the facts, just the facts, regardless of anyone's personal opinion. Means of knowledge, with the duty of using them, are in equity equivalent to knowledge itself, according to the rules stated in Cordova v. Hood in 1872 by the U.S. Supreme Court. And certainly Interim Superintendent Johnson had years of experience, not only in teaching, having been an awarded veteran teacher and principal, as well as in her duties and responsibilities while formerly serving as Superintendent for Administrative Assistant Superintendent for Administrative Services, while Chairperson O'Grady had 19 years of experience as a volunteer on various committees, and had been a mother of children who had attended the Arlington Public Schools, and yet for unknown and unarticulated reasons, even before the Virginia governor, a medical doctor, had issued any order, they had decided, presumably, to cancel in-person instruction on March 14, 2020, just 3 days after the WHO had declared the pandemic emergency, with the issue of Situation Report number 51, which presumably they had read, at a time when, as they reported, the number of cases of COVID-19 outside China had increased 13-fold, and the number of affected countries had tripled. Certainly alarming by sound, finding more than 118,000 cases in 114 countries, attributed to 4,291 fatalities worldwide. But 57 countries had reported 10 cases or less, and more than 90% of the cases were in just 4 countries, and 2 of those, China and the Republic of Korea, were already experiencing significantly declining epidemics. If they were not following orders from the Virginia governor, did Interim Superintendent Johnson and Chairperson O'Grady read that situation report? Number 51. Before canceling in-person instruction for over 29,000 students in grades K through 12. According to the WHO, just 3 days before Interim Superintendent Johnson and Chairperson O'Grady closed the doors at public schools, the WHO had issued the plain and simple statement that describing the situation as a pandemic does not change the WHO's assessment of the threat posed by this virus. Did leadership at Arlington Public Schools ever read the details regarding how the WHO had described the threat that in their assessment had not changed? Very important question. Just a little more than 2 weeks before the pandemic declaration, the WHO had dispatched 1,800 teams of at least 5 epidemiologists to China. One team for every 12th grader in Arlington Public Schools to understand the epidemiological characteristics of epidemic, including its source of infection, transmission routes, susceptible populations, and epidemic characteristics, according to their press statement on February 24, 2020. And those are simply the facts, regardless of anyone's personal opinion. The WHO had made very clear that in China, the average age of the confirmed cases was 51 years old, and nearly 80% of these patients aged 30 to 69 years old, describing no child attending Arlington Public Schools. And while the WHO had acknowledged merely a belief that most common methods of transmission are through respiratory droplets and contact with surfaces contaminated with the virus, that 40-page report emphasized with bold-faced print plain to see on page 12, stating very clearly that asymptomatic infection or transmission through visible signs of infection like coughing and sneezing, expelling droplets, had been reported, but had concluded that asymptomatic infections did not appear to be a major driver of transmission. After a review of 55,924 laboratory-confirmed cases in China, 19 times more cases than had yet been reported in the entire United States, when the interim superintendent and school board chairperson in Arlington decided to close the doors at public schools for reasons as of yet unknown. And yet on all empirical evidence, Interim Superintendent Johnson and Chairperson O'Grady never took the time to discover what asymptomatic infection means, as understood by a physician, did not read the conclusions that had appeared on page 35 of the only 40-page report, that it is not clear whether this even correlates with the presence of an infectious virus, and clearly had failed to note that at that time even China was in the process of reopening its public schools after only 1 month, while the WHO had found the incidence of COVID-19 amongst children in China being less than the flu, and had found not even one incident where it had appeared that that disease had been transmitted from a child to an adult, a disease that by secondary attack rate they had found to represent less than 5% chance of catching, or about your chances of getting into Harvard if you had applied. At that time, the pandemic declaration, the WHO emphasized in that document that pandemic is not a word to use lightly or carelessly, and that it is a word that, if misused, can cause unreasonable fear or unjustified acceptance that the fight is over, leading to unnecessary suffering and death. Noting that the significant fact is that this is the very first pandemic caused by a coronavirus. Only 7 that infect mankind. And those are simply the facts, just the facts, regardless of anyone's personal opinion. This message was approved by Major Mike Webb. Honest.